Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. More than 20 years ago, I fled California as a political refugee and came to Virginia seeking safe refuge from big government. Even though at the time it was managed largely by Democrats, it was a rational place. It's no longer the case now, as Virginia seems to be chasing California down the road to insanity. Let's take a look at some of the things that took place over this year's General Assembly session. We'll start with abortion because you will now be using your tax dollars to pay for abortions. Yes, the General Assembly has removed the restriction on your tax dollars being used to fund abortions, and the governor will certainly sign it. In addition, you will now be able to buy cocktails to go in Virginia. What a wonderful thing, as if we needed that. And yes, the Virginia Senate took time to censure Senator Amanda Chase, even though the Democrats who voted for the previous two items themselves should be censured. Virginia becomes the first state in the South to now ban the death penalty. There are several things that people should pay the ultimate price for, and now in Virginia, they'll probably be let go the next time there's a pandemic, and we'll just forget they ever committed the crime. The Voting Rights Act of Virginia has been passed, and they've approved legislation to make permanent drop boxes where people can put absentee ballots when nobody's looking. And of course, they'll give you prepaid postage for your absentee ballots because, well, you just might not be able to afford to send it in. Also, if you make a mistake on a ballot and it disqualifies your ballot, the locality must call you back and allow you to fix it. Who do you think that benefits? On the topic of evictions, the Virginia General Assembly passed, and the governor will certainly sign more protections for renters, quote-unquote protections, that will last until 2022. If you're a landlord, you must now offer a tenant a payment plan to catch up before pursuing evictions. Also, a tenant's right of redemption has been expanded, and so tenants now have the upper hand in their dealings with landlords. And by the way, if a landlord tries to quote-unquote illegally evict a tenant, the courts will intervene and the landlord will pay the price. On the topic of deeds you've done in the past, it's called expungement. Automatic expungement, 7 or 8 various crimes now will be taken off your record. The court can remove these crimes after 7 years of good behavior. Just unbelievable. That's a clean slate now, they call it, for people seeking jobs and housing. I think if I'm an employer or if I'm a landlord, I would like to have knowledge about the background of my tenant or prospective employee for my own safety and for the edification of my hiring process. On the topic of education, we will now be offering scholarships to the descendants of enslaved workers. So people that never enslaved anyone and people that never were enslaved, they will be having a government-compelled financial transaction. We'll be banning colleges again on the topic of expungement from asking about applicants' criminal records, and allowing illegal aliens to get free college aid paid for by the taxpayer. Mental health facilities no longer required to report undocumented immigrants, they call it, to ICE upon screening. And also privacy protections will be tightened for illegal aliens signing up for driver privilege cards. Oh, you missed that one. Yes, Virginia now offering driver's licenses under a different name to people in the country illegally. On the topic of LGBT, House and Senate are supporting a constitutional amendment to repeal the 2006 amendment defining marriage as God did between a man and a woman. By the way, if you're a Catholic or a Christian adoption agency, you are no longer able to select the home that you feel is a godly home for the children you're adopting out, because now the conscience clause that you'll be able to rely on for religious protection will be removed. Marijuana will be legal in Virginia before long. The original discussion was setting it out to 2024, but the Democrats in charge cannot act fast enough in this. And even though we're totally unprepared for this, and it's a terrible idea, they're trying to get it in effect this year, immediately. On the topic of racism, the Democrats in the General Assembly and the governor will certainly sign a resolution claiming that racism is a public health crisis. And on the topic of keeping Democrats in office in Virginia's single-party rule permanently, there is now rights restoration, a proposed constitutional amendment, restore the voting rights of felons who are released from prison. And finally, the icing on the cake, because of all the good work the Democrats have done in the General Assembly this year, we're going to give raises to our political cronies in state employees, teachers, college and university faculty and employees. Yeah, raise your hand if you're getting a 5% raise this year. It's really astounding what happens in a short time when you put incompetent people or people with evil intentions in positions of power. We're seeing it unveiled before our very eyes. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Support this podcast online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Shaw.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome to the program Erwin W. Lutzer, Pastor Emeritus of the Moody Church, award-winning author of the book We Will Not Be Silenced. And Erwin Lutzer, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm so glad that I can be with you today, Rob, and I thank God for you and your wide audience.
It's such an important book, and reading through this, you touch on a lot of subjects that I've seen scattered in other places, but you put them all together here in a very powerful way. Tell us why you wrote the book, We Will Not Be Silenced.
I wrote it because I began to realize that the radical left in America does not believe that America can be fixed. It has to be destroyed and then rebuilt upon an entirely different humanistic Marxist foundation. And once I understood that, a lot of things that are happening made sense. For example, one of the things that I do is to apply it to history, the tearing down of monuments, the belief that our past has to be vilified so that a new future can arise. And on the other side of this future, we will be seeing the end of white supremacy, income inequality will be gone, and everyone will live, so to speak, happily ever after. That helped me to understand how it is that that's happening. By the way, Rob, while I'm on the topic, people have to understand that classical Marxism was primarily economic. If the government took over all of the means of production and owned everything, then it could distribute it with equity. That was Marxist idea, and revolutions came to Russia, to China, millions were killed. Classical Marxism says We can achieve the same goals, but we can do so incrementally. We can do it by capturing education, by capturing law, by capturing the arts, voting for the right people. The same thing can happen, but it doesn't need a bloody revolution. So cultural Marxism, which is taught oftentimes in our universities, is very, very important. And I'll throw in another, by the way. Marx believed that the family was a unit of oppression. To him, the key to history was oppression. You had the oppressed and you had the oppressors. And the family was a unit of oppression because men oppressed their wives, parents oppressed their children, they took them to Sunday school or church, and God was the ultimate oppressor. What he taught was that the family itself has to be dismantled through women working outside the home and so forth. But here's the point. Let me get into something somewhat controversial. Do black lives matter? Of course black lives matter. Every black life matters. But the organization that takes that mantra admits it is Marxist, and isn't it interesting that on its website it says it believes in the dismantling or the dissolution of the nuclear family. So what we have in today's society, what's happening, is we can better understand it once we understand Marxism. Now, to answer your original question, why did I write the book? I show how Marxism is applied to history, how our history is being rewritten and vilified, how it is applied also to race and to the racial conflict in the United States today, and how it's applied even to freedom of speech issues and the whole issue of propaganda, which I have a chapter on. And then we talk about the sexualization of children, socialism, and so forth. Once we understand the underlying philosophy, it helps us interpret everything that is happening. And also, every chapter in my book, We Will Not Be Silenced, has the response of the church. How should we react as Christians to what's happening in our culture?
This is also important, and I wish we had 5 hours to talk about it, because each one of these topics deserves an hour at least. Erwin, let's go first of all, because I think this is critically important, and I know you can address it well, about our biblical responsibility to speak out on issues of the day, and that includes pastors, but it also includes the church, and a lot of people shirk this responsibility.
Yeah, that's a very sensitive issue, Rob, and the reason is this. Pastors don't want to put up unnecessary stumbling blocks to the gospel, and when it comes to politics, not every candidate or every particular political party is right and the other isn't totally wrong, so they avoid it. So the way you do this is you do speak to issues, but as a pastor of Moody Church for 36 years, I would never endorse a political candidate or a political party. What I did, though, was I spoke to the issues, because I believe that one of the responsibilities of pastors is to help the congregation interpret the cultural streams that are swirling around them. For example, I preached about same-sex marriage. I preached about transgenderism, to give you two examples, because we have to help our congregations process this. But we always do it leading with the gospel, and we emphasize that because that's the centrifugal force of everything that makes sense. Now, here's what's happening, Rob. Churches are conceding to the culture. A Christian leader, and I won't mention his name, but he was asked to speak somewhere in a very famous cathedral, and he did, but he was under criticism because of a message he had preached in 2010 against same-sex marriage, and the LGBTQ community came after him, and he apologized. Let's just take a deep breath. Think of this. How would this apology sound? I am very sorry that in the first century, I wrote a letter that I know has been deeply hurtful to the LGBT community, and God's word should never hurt people. So I'm very sorry that I did it. Signed, the Apostle Paul. My point, of course, I hope is clear. Paul was not, he was writing Romans chapter 1 to a culture that was accepting homosexuality within the church, and he didn't say to himself, now this is such a great stumbling block, I want to avoid it. He dealt with it, and here's the good part. One of the things that's happening in today's world is people are getting saved, and they have no conviction of sin, but they think grace is nice. You know, you need it, especially on weekends. That's being a little sarcastic. Paul wrote this so that people would see sin for what it was, so that they could see grace for what it was. So we shouldn't avoid this. We should preach with brokenness in our hearts and with tears, not judgmentally, but pastors have to help their congregations interpret what is happening in their culture.
I want to go into some of the very specific issues in the secular left's intent to destroy America, and you've referenced these, Erwin. The first one I want to go to is the revision of history and the destruction of monuments. And the reason I want to start there is we're in Charlottesville, Virginia, which has been a flashpoint for this issue. There was a huge race riot here back in 2017. And since then, a number of our historical monuments have been taken or are in the process of being removed. So what is this all about? Because there's more to it than meets the eye.
There really is. And isn't that interesting that you should mention that? And I certainly remember what happened in your city. But just yesterday on the news here in Chicago, they said that 40 monuments were under discussion, and they wanted people's response as to whether or not they should be taken down. And this is in response to the fact that last year in 2020, the statue of Christopher Columbus, there was a great riot against it, and our mayor had it taken down at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dead of night, and that statue is, I don't know where it is, but it's no longer there. Now, here's the point. When you think of this, you think, for example, of the Red Guard in China. When China changed into a distinctly communist country, let's say 1949, they destroyed all Western monuments, they burned all Western books. What they were saying was, we're building on a new foundation. Now, I don't know how old you are, Rob, but I'm old enough to remember when St. Petersburg was, first of all, it was called Leningrad, and then Stalingrad, and now it's back to St. Petersburg. Each person who came along wanted to vilify the past so that they could build a new future. And that's what's happening in our schools. You know, the 1619 Project, that America was actually begun in 1619, and the two great principles are slavery and capitalism. The whole idea, projects like this, is to vilify our past, to give reason to want to change the Constitution, which is seen as a supremacist white document, so that America can be rebuilt on a different foundation. And that's what's happening. And, you know, I quote the historian, Arthur Schlesinger, who was a confidant of President Kennedy. And you remember what he said? He said that history is to a nation what memory is to a person. Now, you and I know that if a person loses his memory, he becomes whatever people say he is. And people want us to forget our memory, to forget the Judeo-Christian base, and to build it on a different foundation, and to remake what it fundamentally means to be American.
It's a frightening situation because we're watching all of this unfold before our eyes. We're talking with Erwin Lutzer. The book is We Will Not Be Silenced. Now, I want to go to a story that I broke here recently, and it involves pretty much everything you've been talking about so far, our local government schools here in Charlottesville. demeaning the Founding Fathers, demeaning the Constitution as essentially a racist document, and then mixing in sexuality, the LGBTQ agenda, starting in kindergarten, mixing that all in with race and history. And I'd love to get your take on this intersectionality and why they're doing it this way.
You know, in my book that we're talking about, I have an entire chapter on the sexualization of children. Rob, what is happening in your schools, what is happening here in Chicago, is worse than terrible. Children are being brainwashed, that America is basically a very racist nation. And when you talk about social justice, and by the way, in my book I distinguish biblical justice from social justice. When you talk about social justice as it is taught, it is radical sexualism, it is transgenderism, it is taking the words such as justice and applying it to every liberal cause. So you have environmental justice and sexual justice and sexual equality. And this is being taught to our children. They are being indoctrinated into leftist, destructive teachings. And I say to the parents out there, God is going to hold you responsible for the teaching of your children. If they have to go to a public school, what you need to do when they get home every single day, go over what they have been taught and help them to think rightly and what the errors are. If it comes to the point where they are taught pornography and everything, which is happening here in Illinois, you actually have to remove your children. And the answer might be a faith-based school. Not everyone can homeschool, I understand that. But the educational system is so bad, and parents need to cry up to God for wisdom as to what to do.
Indeed, it's the case. I want to talk a little bit more about what you reference in the book as the demonic nature of the transgender movement and transgenderism, because a lot of people look at this with an innocuous eye. In other words, it's not really hurting anything. Tell us why this is hurtful to God and to our society.
Well, first of all, of course, transgenderism is indeed shaking your fist in God's face. But even apart from that, and I should say, I guess, because of that, it is very hurtful because it brings about sexual confusion. And the whole idea that you are who you identify with, regardless of the body that God gave you, is utter and total foolishness. It's nonsense. And why should you take your body and mutilate it to make it fit your mind? Wouldn't it be better to get some help in making your mind be in harmony with your body? So the confusion that is brought about is huge. And you know that teenagers are oftentimes unsure of who they are. So they begin to experiment. They begin to think, I'm Bert when I'm at school, but I'm actually Bertha at home. I'm a girl. In fact, I know a situation where a girl said, I actually believe in my heart I'm a fuzzy. And somebody said, what's a fuzzy? And she said, a cat. Well, don't argue with her. If she identifies as a cat, well, then she is a cat, because after all, you are the king of your identity. And so the absurdity and the insanity is beyond belief. And yet those are the kinds of concepts that are being taught today.
I'd like to go to the topic of equity versus equality, and you referenced equity earlier on, Erwin, as a Marxist concept, and yet we're hearing this word equity being used from the top on down in this country at all levels of government and all levels of discourse.
Exactly, because equity has to do with a Marxist notion of putting people in boxes. And let's talk about race for just a moment, because that relates to your question. See, Marx wanted to put people in as oppressed and oppressors. And I point out in the book that Saul Alinsky believed that Marxism could be applied to race for the benefit of achieving power. So the whole idea is that the whites are the oppressors and the minorities are the oppressed. And conflict between the two is necessary. It has to be continual. And eventually, hopefully, the oppressed will overcome the oppressors. That's where we are going. And so what equity means is that we give preferences based on skin color. Now, all of this is totally contrary to Martin Luther King, who said that we should not judge people on the basis of their skin color, but rather the conduct and their character. And so what you have today is Marxist boxes that need to be checked. And that's where the whole equity thing comes in. It is different from equality. And by the way, even the word equality, as I point out, is totally misused.
Yes.
Marriage equality, reproductive equality, and all those things. That's actually where we're going. And we see this every single day on the news, the talk about equity. The problem with that is on many different levels. It denies individuality. There's really no opportunity for reconciliation. Now, I point out in the book that Christianity is actually the answer to this. Because as Christians, when it comes to racism, we say there isn't really that much difference between us. We are all sinners. We all come to the cross for forgiveness. And having done that, we ask, what can we do together to make society and our environment of the neighborhoods and all, how can we make that better? Bottom line, Rob, Christianity says we don't have a skin problem, we have a sin problem. And all of these diversity studies are tearing apart what Jesus Christ died to bring together.
We also have on the topic of race and equity the discussion of white privilege and also white guilt. We're hearing it here in Charlottesville, but it's across the country. It's become a buzzword, and it's just basically now accepted as a fact, at least by the mainstream media.
Well, in my book, and We Will Not Be Silenced, which is what we're talking about, I actually quote the black leader, Shelby Steele, and who points out that this whole idea of white guilt is being used to refer to people who want unearned benefits. Benefits is the word that comes to mind in our society. How are we going to achieve any sense of unity and help as long as we are filled with accusations where one group uses the other group to explain and to defend their failures, etc.? This is not going anywhere except the division of the races, which is exactly what the leftists want. They do not want reconciliation. What they want is continual, perpetual conflict. And that's why you have all these diversity studies in our university. By the way, one of the reasons I wrote the book is so that parents would understand, why is it that when I send my child to university and college, why is it that they come back hating America?
It's a terrible situation. We continue our conversation with Erwin Lutzer. The book is We Will Not Be Silenced. I want to go now to something you spend some time on in the book, and again, this could require its own hour, but Islam's alliance with the American left. What do they have in common, and at what point do they turn on each other?
Well, they will eventually turn on each other once America is destroyed and they decide what to do with this country. But here's the point. I show that the radical left and Islam are presently together because they do share a common agenda, and that is the destruction of Christianity and the destruction of capitalism. By the way, I also have a chapter in the book, as you well know, on socialism, and maybe someday we'll get a chance to talk about that. But here's the point. The ACLU wants to separate church and state, but they don't in any way think that that's necessary when it comes to mosque and state. And I give examples of how Islam is being taught in some schools, and when parents object, they are vilified on social media because they're bigoted, they're anti-Islamic, and all the other things. Where's the ACLU? The point is that for now, they are friends because in the military, what does it say? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. For now. But of course, they hold two different worldviews, two very different worldviews. And that's why, by the way, the radical left will never criticize Islam for its treatment of women and so forth, because for now they share a common agenda. Destroy Christianity and capitalism. And then after that, of course, they would want to go in two different directions. But for now, they are bedfellows, so to speak.
You mentioned propaganda earlier, and I think this is very important for us to at least touch on for a couple of minutes. People don't realize, and perhaps it's the nature of propaganda, that they're being brainwashed. What's going on in America today?
I talk about collective demonization. By the way, the purpose of propaganda is to so shape people's perception of reality that even when faced with a mountain of evidence, they will not change their minds. So that's the purpose. But collective demonization, I discuss that in the book. Collective demonization is exactly what we are seeing in our society today, where, and this was perfected in Russia, once someone was deleted, so to speak, by the elites, everybody else chimed in. People wrote letters against this person even though they had never met them or knew anything about them, because everybody wanted to show, I'm on the side of the elites that have power. I wrote a book about Nazi Germany years ago. It's entitled Hitler's Cross. There were churches in Germany that would put out a Nazi flag on their door. What they were saying was, when you come for the Christians, don't come for us because we're on your side. And in my book, I quote Churchill. Isn't this an awesome quote? Churchill said that an appeaser is someone who feeds the alligator with the hope that the alligator will eat him last. So what you find throughout our society today is people are feeding the alligator. They are virtue signaling. They're saying, am I woke enough to be seen as virtuous? That's the issue that people are asking.
Let's talk about the plan moving forward. The first part of this is what's coming next when we think we've seen it all. There's more to come. And then what is the plan for the church and for individuals and moving beyond fear?
I end the book with the words of Jesus to the church in Sardis, strengthen what remains. And I believe that that's the word that Jesus would say to us. And the last chapter, I write out what I think Jesus would say to us if he were writing a letter to the American church. Now, the church in Sardis, Jesus said, you are dead. You think you're alive, but you're actually dead. But I want to leave this with our listeners today. Also in that letter, in the 3rd chapter of the book of Revelation, Jesus said this. He said, but there are still some people in Sardis who walk with me in white, and they shall, who have not soiled their garments. Let me get that right. There's still some people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white. And I want to appeal to everyone who's listening today. Your church might not be what it should be. Our culture is putting tremendous pressure on us, but let us be among those that Jesus referenced as those who have not soiled our garments, and we will walk with him in white.
Erwin Lutzer, if people would like to get a copy of the book, We Will Not Be Silenced, or if they would like to follow your work online, tell us how they can do that.
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, regarding the book, they may want to go wherever books are sold, Amazon. By the way, Christian Book Distributors sells it, I think, for 50% off, so they might want to go to that website, christianbooks.com. But you know what they can do? They can go to our media ministry at the Moody Church, access our media ministry. And by the way, for a gift of any amount, the book can be yours. In other words, if you want to support our ministry. And what you can do is to go to MCM, that stands for Moody Church Media, mcmoffer.com. And in this way, they would also help us in our media ministry.
It's such an important book, and you've done a wonderful job of laying out the topics. People need to study this and then take it in and act on it. Erwin W. Lutzer, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
And thank you so much, and let us remember the name of the book, We Will Not Be Silenced. Thank you so much, Rob. God bless you, and you have a good day.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,